Welcome back to your newest obsession, the NeuroSpicy MomPod. As always, I'm your host, Austin Marie, and I am so glad you're here. If you're new around here, this is the little corner of the internet where we dive into neuroscience, psychology, neurodivergence, healing, reparenting ourselves, and all of the wonderfully complicated ways our brains interact with the world around us. The goal here is to give you the information and language to understand yourself with a little more compassion. Because when we understand why our brains work the way they do, we stop blaming ourselves quite so much. And that opens the door for change. Today's episode is one that I think is important because I think it has the potential to explain so many of the communication struggles that neurodivergent people experience every single day. Whether you've ever walked away from a conversation thinking, I genuinely have no idea how they came to that conclusion, or you've found yourself constantly saying, that's not what I meant, then today's episode is for you. We're going to spend some time talking about something called top-down processing and bottom-up processing. These are concepts that come from cognitive psychology and neuroscience, and while researchers continue to refine exactly how those processes differ across individuals, they provide an incredibly useful framework for understanding why two people can hear the exact same words, witness the exact same event, and yet walk away with completely different interpretations of what just happened. And I want to make one thing very clear before we get started, because I think conversations like this can accidentally become divisive if we're not careful. Today is not about deciding which type of brain is better. It's not about saying neurotypical brains are wrong or neurodivergent brains are superior. Human brains are incredibly complex. Every single one of us uses both top-down and bottom-up processing every day. The difference is that research suggests we often differ in which styles we tend to rely on more heavily. So put simply, think of today's episode as learning about two different ways of building meaning from the exact same information. Now, before we dive into those definitions, I want to share an example I was told as a way to understand what this can look like. Let's say you're working on a 1,000-piece puzzle. One person opens the box, immediately studies the picture on the front, notices a lighthouse at sunset, organizes the edge pieces, starts making predictions about where different colors belong, and begins assembling the image using what they already know. Even before they have every piece in place, their brain is constantly filling in the gaps. Another person dumps all the pieces onto the table and starts examining them one by one. They notice the shapes, they notice the colors, they compare tiny details. They slowly begin connecting pieces together until over time, the larger picture starts to emerge. Eventually, both people finish the same puzzle. The difference isn't intelligence or even effort. The difference is the direction they use to construct understanding. That analogy captures the heart of what we're talking about today. Let's start with top-down processing. Top-down processing is when your brain interprets new information using what it already knows. Instead of treating every new experience as completely unique, your brain relies on previous experiences, memories, expectations, social rules, and context to predict what something probably means. So the perception is guided by prior knowledge, experiences, and expectations, and that influences the interpretation of sensory information. In neuroscience, we often talk about how the brain is like a prediction machine. Contrary to what many of us learned in school, your brain isn't simply sitting back waiting for information to arrive. Every second of every day, it is making educated guesses about what is about to happen next. It's constantly shifting through sensory input that isn't necessarily important for your brain to hold on to and then turn into long-term memory. If you ever driven home from work and suddenly realized you don't remember the last several turns you took, your brain wasn't asleep. It was relying on an incredibly efficient system of predictions. It already knew the route. It anticipated the traffic lights. It expected the stop signs. It filled in enormous amounts of information without requiring your conscious attention. In fact, during one of the many professional development days as a teacher, one of the instructors was speaking about neuroplasticity and had said that a super simple way to build new synapses is to simply take a totally new route on your way home today, something your brain cannot predict, and you will build new brain pathways. The route home you take the most will soon become the stronger neurological pathway in your brain as well. That efficiency is one of the brain's greatest strengths because thinking deeply about every single stimulus around us would be exhausting. If your brain had to consciously analyze every tree, every sound, every facial expression, every sentence, every footstep, every moment of light, you would never get through your day. So instead, your brain creates what psychologists call schemas. Schemas are essentially mental frameworks. They consist of past experiences, prior knowledge, emotions, and expectations. And we use them in order to make our own hypothesis on new information. Think of them like filing cabinets that organize everything you've learned throughout your life. You have a schema for birthdays. There's a schema for grocery stores and for classrooms. There's a schema for what a doctor appointment usually looks like, and you have a schema for what conversations with your friends look like. When something new happens, your brain quickly asks, which filing cabinet does this one belong in? Once it decides, it begins filing in missing information based on previous experiences. So imagine someone walks into your kitchen and says, "Can you hand me the milk?" Most people don't stop and ask a dozen follow-up questions. They assume the speaker means the milk in the refrigerator. They assume the person probably wants it now. And they assume the conversation is happening because someone is making coffee, cereal, or breakfast. None of that information was actually spoken aloud. Your brain generated it. That's top-down processing. Now let's take a look at how this would look when looking through the lens of bottom-up processing. Bottom-up processing starts from the opposite direction. Instead of beginning with assumptions and then interpreting details through that lens, bottom-up processing begins with the details themselves. So, if you ask, "Can you hand me the milk?" someone using bottom-up processing would think, "You said the milk. Which milk? The regular milk, the oat milk, or the almond milk? Do you want me to hand it to you, pour it for you, or set it on the counter? Are you asking me to do it right now or after I'm done with what I'm doing?" Information comes in first, and the meaning gets built afterward. That is why bottom-up processing is also known as data-driven processing, because it begins with information processing. So with bottom-up processing, perception is driven by the external stimulus itself. The sensory data is interpreted based on its inherent properties without pre-existing knowledge or concepts and focuses on interpreting sensory information in real time. Imagine looking at a painting from only 2 inches away. You notice every individual brushstroke, every texture, every single tiny color variation. Only after you've stepped back far enough do you begin to see that complete picture. Many autistic researchers and clinicians describe autistic cognition as tending towards this style of information processing, rather than allowing previous expectations to dominate interpretation. Autistic brains often appear to place greater emphasis on the incoming sensory information itself before deciding what it means. That distinction might sound subtle, but it changes almost everything. For me, it explains why I feel the need to give each and every kind of context possible when trying to explain something to someone. Instead of assuming I already know what this probably means, the brain asks, what evidence do I actually have? And instead of relying heavily on expectations, it gathers data for clarity. And instead of filling in blanks automatically, it often notices that there are blanks. This is one reason many neurodivergent people ask clarifying questions that others find surprising. When someone asks, "I'll be there later," one brain hears, "Okay, sometime this afternoon," and another brain immediately wonders, later as in 15 minutes, 2 hours, tomorrow? What does exactly later mean? Neither brain is trying to be difficult. They're simply solving different problems in different ways. One prioritizes speed and efficiency, and the other prioritizes precision and accuracy. Now, this is where I want to introduce a concept that has become incredibly influential in modern cognitive neuroscience, and that's something called predictive processing. One of the leading theories in cognitive neuroscience today It attempts to understand how the brain generates consciousness, how our bodies influence cognition, and how cognition alters perception. The predictive processing framework uses two primary neural signals that work together to shape our consciousness, suggesting that the brain is constantly balancing two sources of information. The first is what it predicts will happen based on everything it has experienced before, top down predictions. And the second is what is actually happening right now through your senses, bottom up processing. Your brain compares these two streams of information every second of every day. If reality matches the prediction, your brain gets to save some energy. If reality surprises the prediction, your brain has to update its internal model. Think about how many times you've reached into your refrigerator without looking because you already know where that milk lives. Your brain predicts where your hand needs to go before your eyes have even confirmed it. Most of the time, those predictions are correct, but occasionally someone rearranges the shelves and suddenly your hand is reaching for empty space. Just for a fraction of a second, your brain experiences what neuroscientists call a prediction error. The world didn't match the expectation, so your brain has to pause, gather new information, and update its understanding. Now imagine extending that same process beyond refrigerators and into conversations, relationships, workplaces, classrooms, and social expectations. Every conversation, facial expression, every pause in someone's voice involves predictions. Remember that researchers suggest that many autistic individuals may rely somewhat less on prior expectations and somewhat more on incoming information when making sense of their world. While this isn't true for every person and it isn't the whole story of autism, it helps explain why many neurodivergent people report feeling like everyone else is making invisible assumptions that they were never told about. And honestly, that's one of the reasons I wanted to dedicate an entire episode to this topic. Because once you understand that people may literally be constructing meaning using different cognitive strategies, so many lifelong misunderstandings begin making sense, and it becomes easier to understand why one person walks away thinking that conversation went great, while the other spends the next 3 days replaying every sentence trying to figure out what actually happened. I saw a video explaining how neurodivergence is really a difference in communication, and I think this is a piece to understanding why that is. It helps explain why some people value precision while others value efficiency. It explains why some people hear the emotional implication first, while others hear the literal words first. And perhaps most importantly, it explains to us how communication isn't simply about choosing the right words. It's about recognizing that another person's brain may be building an entirely different understanding from the exact same words. And now that we've built the foundation for how these two processing styles generally work, in the next part of the episode, we're going to move out of theory and into real life because this isn't just something happening in laboratories or psychology textbooks. This shows up in marriages, friendships, workplaces, therapy offices, parenting, and probably every difficult conversation you've ever had. So now that we've built the foundation for these two processing styles, let's move into what it actually looks like in our everyday life. Because I don't know about you, but I'm obsessed with those moments when I can point to a moment in my life and think, that's what my brain was doing. One of the biggest misconceptions about communication is that we assume words carry meaning all by themselves. We tend to think that if I say something clearly enough, you'll understand exactly what I meant. But communication doesn't actually work that way. Words are only one piece of the equation. The listener's brain has to interpret those words, and that interpretation is influenced by everything we've just talked about: our expectations, your previous experiences, our emotional state, our memories, and the way our brain naturally constructs meaning, while also keeping in mind that most of our communication is nonverbal. In other words, communication is never just about what is said. It's about what the other person's brain built from what was said. That's why two people can sit through the exact same meeting at work and leave with completely different understandings of what their boss expected, or why siblings can remember the exact same childhood event completely different. It's why two partners can have what they both believe was the same conversation and yet spend the next 3 days arguing about it. Neither person is necessarily lying or trying to manipulate the other, but their brains may have genuinely constructed different realities from the exact same information. Let's take a really common relationship example. Imagine one partner says, "You never listen to me." If you're someone who naturally processes information from top down, your brain may immediately recognize this as emotional language. You understand that never probably isn't a literal statistic. You interpret it as, "I'm feeling lonely," or "I'm feeling unheard," or "I need more emotional connection." But someone who leans towards more bottom up processing may hear something very different. Their brain might immediately begin searching through specific memories. "That's not true. Yesterday we talked for 30 minutes after dinner. Last week I helped you solve that problem with your coworker. I listened to you when you told me about your doctor's appointment." Do you see what just happened? One person was communicating an emotional experience. The other person responded to the literal accuracy of the words. And here's the really heartbreaking part. Both people often leave that interaction feeling misunderstood. One thinks, "Why are you arguing with my feelings?" And the other thinks, "Why are you accusing me of something that's objectively not true?" Neither person intended to hurt the other. They were simply responding to different layers of the conversation. This is also one of the reasons neurodivergent people are so often described as being too literal. I have to admit, I've never particularly liked that phrase because I think it oversimplifies what's actually happening. Being literal isn't a character flaw or a lack of empathy, and it doesn't convey an inability to understand emotion. It's often the result of a brain that has learned to place a higher value on precision than assumption. Think about how often our everyday language depends on implication rather than specificity. "I'm fine. We should get together sometime. Can you do this when you get a chance? I'm almost there." Every single one of those sentences requires the listener to fill in missing information. How fine is fine? What does sometime mean? How long is almost? And how urgent is when you get a chance? For many neurotypical communicators, those blanks are filled almost automatically using context and social convention. For many neurodivergent communicators, those blanks remain invisible. And if you ever found yourself asking what you thought was a perfectly reasonable clarifying question, only to have someone sigh dramatically and say, "You know what I meant. This might be why." Your brain wasn't trying to be difficult, it was trying to be accurate. Now, let's take this into the workplace because this is where these differences can have very real consequences. Imagine your supervisor says, "I'd like that report soon." One employee hears before the end of the day, another hears whenever you finish your other assignments. Another hears, "This is a high priority." Someone else hears, "I don't exactly know what soon means, so I need more information before I can prioritize this." Who misunderstood? Honestly, maybe nobody. The instruction itself left room for interpretation. This is something we call ambiguity, and ambiguity requires the brain to make assumptions. Some brains are just more comfortable making those assumptions than others. Now imagine the supervisor becomes frustrated because the report wasn't finished when they expected. From their perspective, the expectation was obvious. From the employee's perspective, the expectation was never actually communicated. Neither person necessarily intended for conflict to happen. The conflict emerged because each brain filled in the missing information differently. This is also why many autistic adults describe feeling like everyone else received an invisible instruction manual for social interaction that they somehow missed. There are so many unspoken rules in everyday conversation. We soften criticism instead of saying exactly what we mean. We hint instead of asking directly. We imply instead of stating, and we expect people to read between the lines. But reading between the lines depends on having learned which lines are supposed to exist in the first place. And that learning is influenced by culture, personality, trauma, language, neurotype, family dynamics, and countless other experiences. There's another concept in psychology that fits beautifully here, and it's called the false consensus effect. The false consensus effect is our tendency to assume that other people think the way we think. In other words, we unconsciously believe our interpretation is the obvious interpretation. If I meant it that way, surely you understood it that way. But that's rarely true. Every single person listening to this episode has a unique collection of memories, experiences, beliefs, fears, and expectations. Those experiences become the lens lens through which new information is interpreted. And that's before we even add trauma into the equation, because trauma changes prediction too. Remember earlier when we talked about the brain consistently making predictions about the world? Well, trauma teaches the brain to predict danger. If you've spent years being criticized, your nervous system may begin experiencing criticism even when none was intended. If you've experienced betrayal, your brain may be predicting rejection before it happens. And if you've grown up walking on eggshells, your nervous system may become exquisitely sensitive to changes in tone of voice, facial expressions, or pauses in conversation, because at one point in your life, noticing those tiny details may have genuinely helped keep you safe. That's not overreacting. That's a prediction system doing exactly what it was trained to do. And when you combine trauma with a bottom-up processing style, something really interesting can happen. A person may notice dozens of tiny details that others overlook: a slight hesitation before somebody answers, a change in facial expression that lasts only a second, a sentence that didn't quite match the person's body language. Those details are real. The brain isn't inventing them. Where misunderstandings sometimes happen is the interpretation of those details. Not because the observations are wrong, but because there are often multiple possible explanations for the same behavior. A pause might mean discomfort, or maybe distraction, or someone trying to remember what they were about to say, or even that they realized they left the oven on. The detail is accurate. The meaning still requires interpretation, and that's something every brain has to do. Whether you lean more toward top-down processing or bottom-up processing, none of us experience the world exactly as it is. We experience the world through the models our brains are consistently building. Understanding that has profoundly changed the way I think about communication, because instead of asking who's right, I find myself asking a different question. What information was each person's brain using to build their understanding? And sometimes simply asking that question is enough to turn an argument into curiosity. As we wrap up today's episode, I want to leave you with this one final thought. I think one of the greatest misconceptions we've inherited about communication is the belief that understanding should be automatic. We assume that if our intentions were good and our words were clear, then everyone should walk away with the same understanding. But neuroscience tells us something much more interesting than that. Communication is not the transfer of information, it's the construction of meaning. Every single conversation is a collaboration between two nervous systems, two histories, two sets of experiences, and two brains that have spent decades learning how to predict the world in slightly different ways. And when we begin to understand that, something really great happens. Instead of immediately assuming that someone is being rude, difficult, dramatic, argumentative, overly sensitive, or intentionally misunderstanding us, we can become curious. We can ask, what information is their brain using that mine isn't? Because curiosity creates connection. Certainty often creates conflict. I think it's one of the greatest gifts neuroscience gives us. It reminds us that most people are doing the best they can with the brain they have, the experiences they've survived, and the information available to them in that moment. That definitely doesn't mean we excuse harmful behavior or ignore our boundaries. No way. It simply means we stop assuming that different automatically means wrong. For those of us who are neurodivergent, I hope this episode gives you language for experiences you've probably had your entire life. Maybe now you'll understand why you've always asked clarifying questions, why vague instructions can feel genuinely stressful, or why you've sometimes walked away from conversations feeling like everyone else received information that was never actually spoken aloud. And for those of you who love someone whose brain works differently than yours, I hope this gives you a little more compassion too. Sometimes the most supportive thing we can do isn't repeat ourselves louder or become frustrated that someone doesn't get it. Sometimes it's slowing down enough to realize that they're building meaning from a completely different starting point. At the end of the day, better communication isn't about becoming the same. It's about learning how to translate. And maybe that's what empathy really is, not expecting someone else's brain to work like ours, but being willing to understand the world from where they're standing. Before you go this week, I want to leave you with a journal prompt. Think back to a recent conversation that didn't go the way you expected. Maybe it ended in frustration. Maybe you walked away feeling misunderstood or someone else left feeling hurt. Instead of asking yourself who was right, ask yourself these questions. What assumptions was I making that I never actually said out loud? What assumptions might the other person have been making that I didn't recognize? What information was I using to build meaning, and what information might they have been using? And finally, if I could have that conversation again, with the understanding I have today, what would I communicate differently? You might be surprised how much clarity comes from looking at that same conversation through a different lens. If today's episode resonated with you, the best way to support the NeuroSpicy MomPod is completely free. Make sure you're following the show on whatever platform you're listening on. Leave a rating or review if your app allows it. And please share this episode with someone who immediately came to mind while you were listening. Every share helps this grassroots community reach another person who might finally hear something that makes them feel understood. If you're in a season of life where you're able and feel called to support the show financially, you can join us over on the Patreon, where even $1 monthly membership genuinely makes a difference. It helps me continue researching these topics, writing these episodes, creating educational content, and building this little grassroots community that I hope continues to grow into something that helps not only my family, but countless other neurodivergent families in the future. Whether you're here as a free listener, a paid subscriber, or this is somehow the very first episode you've ever stumbled across, thank you. Thank you for trusting me with your time, your curiosity, and your nervous system. I don't take that lightly. Until next week, be gentle with yourself, be curious with others, and remember that understanding doesn't always begin with having the right answer. Sometimes it begins with asking a better question. Take care of yourself and take care of your nervous systems. Ta-ta.